For decades, the US and Canadian auto industries ran like twin engines. Tariffs, politics, and protectionist policies have jammed the gears of one of the world's strongest manufacturing partnerships. Ottawa's firing back with legal threats.
What unfolded this week was not just another chapter in a trade war, but a sudden rupture that threatened to fracture the economic backbone of North American manufacturing, placing workers, prices, and political stability on a collision course. The decision by the United States to impose new auto tariffs sent immediate shockwaves through an industry built on decades of cross-border integration. Within hours, production lines slowed, uncertainty spread across manufacturing corridors, and thousands of workers found themselves facing sudden disruption, not because demand collapsed, not because factories failed, but because trade policy changed overnight. This moment matters far beyond a single plant or a single sector. The automotive industry is one of the most interconnected economic systems in the world, where parts cross borders repeatedly before a vehicle ever reaches a showroom. When tariffs intervene in that system, the impact does not stop at corporate balance sheets. It moves quickly into household incomes, consumer prices, regional employment, and political pressure on both sides of the border. Canada's response was swift, calculated, and deeply revealing. Rather than panic or denial, policymakers, labor leaders, and industry executives aligned around a clear message. This disruption was artificial, dangerous, and could not go unanswered. But what Canada chose to do next may surprise many Americans. Because beneath the headlines, Canada is executing a forceful and deliberate countermove that goes far beyond symbolic retaliation. And by the end of this analysis, we will expose the underreported consequence of these tariffs, a shift that could permanently weaken the United States manufacturing leverage while accelerating Canada's strategic independence in North American auto production. In a modern vehicle, parts do not originate in a single country. Engines, transmissions, electronics, and structural components often cross the border between the United States and Canada multiple times before final assembly. This is not inefficiency. It is specialization. Each country focuses on what it does best, creating scale, lowering costs, and sustaining hundreds of thousands of well-paid industrial jobs. Tariffs inserted friction into every one of those crossings, raising costs at each step. For manufacturers, the problem was immediate. Production schedules became uncertain. Inventory planning lost reliability. Investment assumptions made years earlier were suddenly invalid. Even profitable plants faced shutdown risks, not because of market failure, but because policy risk replaced commercial logic. This is why the trade war hit autos faster than many other sectors. There was no buffer. Workers felt the consequences first. In communities tied to assembly plants and parts suppliers, uncertainty spread rapidly. Overtime disappeared. Temporary layoffs followed. The anxiety was not abstract. It was personal, household by household, paycheck by paycheck. And crucially, these workers understood something that often gets lost in political debate. This disruption did not originate from falling demand or foreign competition. It came from tariffs imposed by the United States in the name of protection. Canada recognized that reality early. Officials did not deny the seriousness of the situation. Instead, they framed the tariffs as an artificial shock within an otherwise competitive and productive system. That framing mattered. It allowed Ottawa to justify action not as escalation in a trade war, but as defense of national economic capacity and social stability. At the same time, Canada made a deliberate choice not to mirror the rhetoric coming from Washington. There were no emotional declarations, no threats of collapse. The message was colder and more strategic. Integrated supply chains benefit both countries. Disrupting them harms workers and consumers on both sides of the border. And if the United States insisted on tariffs, Canada would respond in ways designed to protect its own long-term position. But this was only the first layer of the response. Behind closed doors, a more consequential calculation was already underway. And the next phase reveals why these tariffs may end up costing the United States far more than policymakers anticipated. As the trade war escalated, the economic consequences moved quickly from factory floors into the broader economy. Auto tariffs imposed by the United States did not remain confined to manufacturers or exporters. They spread through pricing structures, labor markets, and consumer behavior in ways that policymakers often underestimate. For manufacturers operating in Canada, the sudden introduction of tariffs rewrote cost calculations overnight. Components crossing the border now carried added expense at every stage of production. Even firms that maintained final assembly inside the United States faced higher input costs due to their dependence on Canadian-made parts. The result was a squeeze on margins that could not be absorbed indefinitely. Companies responded in predictable ways. Capital spending plans were paused. Hiring slowed. Temporary layoffs became permanent in some supplier networks. Smaller parts manufacturers, operating with thinner margins, were hit hardest. These firms often lack the flexibility to reroute supply chains quickly, making them especially vulnerable during a trade war driven by tariffs rather than market forces. For workers, the impact was immediate and personal. Auto sector jobs are among the most stable and well-compensated industrial positions in North America. When those jobs become uncertain, the effect ripples outward. Local retail spending declines. Housing markets soften. Municipal tax bases come under strain. The tariffs introduced by the United States thus translated into community-level economic stress across southern Ontario and beyond. Consumers also felt the pressure. Vehicles assembled with higher cost components inevitably became more expensive. Prices increased not because of innovation or improved quality, but because tariffs distorted the flow of goods. For middle-income households already facing elevated costs for housing, fuel, and food, even modest increases in vehicle prices carried real consequences. From a macroeconomic perspective, the trade war began undermining one of the core strengths of the North American economy, efficiency through integration. Tariffs introduced friction where none had existed, weakening competitiveness against global rivals who operate within larger, more predictable trade blocs. In attempting to protect domestic industry, the United States risked making that industry less competitive over time. And this economic pressure set the stage for something deeper, because as costs rose and uncertainty spread, Canada's response began shifting from short-term damage control toward a structural rethinking of its economic future. Beyond balance sheets and employment figures, the trade war carried a significant social dimension. When tariffs disrupt stable employment, the consequences extend into mental health, family security, and political trust. In Canada, this reality shaped both public reaction and government response. Workers affected by shutdowns and reduced hours spoke openly about anxiety and frustration, not directed at their employers, but at the unpredictability of trade policy. Many understood that their jobs were viable under normal conditions. What they questioned was whether long-term careers could survive repeated shocks driven by political decisions outside their control. This sentiment mattered politically. Canada's labor institutions remain influential, and their response was not confrontational, but coordinated. Unions framed the tariffs as a threat to national economic resilience rather than a bilateral dispute. That framing helped consolidate public support for government action while avoiding internal division. For policymakers, the challenge was maintaining social stability while navigating a trade war with the United States, Canada's largest trading partner. The decision to deploy counter-tariffs was paired with explicit commitments to worker support, retraining, and reinvestment. This was not presented as retaliation. It was presented as insurance against prolonged disruption. Public trust became a critical variable. By acknowledging the severity of the impact rather than minimizing it, Canadian leaders reinforced confidence in institutions. They positioned the state as an active stabilizer rather than a passive observer. In doing so, Canada contrasted itself with the growing uncertainty perceived in the United States, where tariff policy appeared subject to abrupt change. This contrast did not go unnoticed internationally. Investors, allies, and trading partners began reassessing relative risk. Stability, predictability, and rule-based governance suddenly carried measurable economic value, and Canada quietly began benefiting from that reassessment. But the most consequential effects were still ahead. because as social pressure mounted and economic costs accumulated, Canada's strategy evolved beyond protection and toward repositioning. And the next phase reveals how this trade war may accelerate shifts that Washington did not anticipate. From Washington's perspective, auto tariffs were presented as a corrective measure. The stated objective was clear: protect domestic manufacturing, strengthen negotiating leverage, and reduce perceived vulnerabilities in the United States industrial base. In political terms, the message was simple and resonant. In economic terms, the outcome proved far more complex. The automotive sector does not function as a collection of isolated national factories. It operates as a continental system. By imposing tariffs within that system, the United States effectively taxed its own supply chain. American manufacturers reliant on Canadian components faced higher costs immediately. These costs did not disappear. They moved downstream into pricing decisions, production volumes, and employment planning. For consumers in the United States, the implications became unavoidable. Vehicles assembled domestically incorporated higher-priced inputs. Financing costs compounded the pressure. What began as a policy aimed at protecting American workers risked translating into higher prices for American households, particularly for middle-income and older consumers who depend on reliable transportation rather than discretionary upgrades. At the corporate level, uncertainty became the dominant concern. Auto manufacturing decisions are made on timelines measured in decades, not election cycles. When tariffs shift without warning, confidence erodes. Investment is delayed. New plants are reconsidered. Even firms inclined to expand production inside the United States began questioning whether long-term policy stability could be assumed. This created a paradox. In the name of strengthening the United States industrial position during a trade war, tariffs introduced risks that made that position less attractive relative to alternative jurisdictions. Allies began asking whether policy volatility had become a structural feature rather than a temporary phase. And it was at this point that Canada's posture began changing the broader calculus. Because while the United States emphasized leverage, Canada emphasized reliability. And in global capital markets, reliability often proves more valuable than rhetoric. Internationally, Canada's response to tariffs sent a signal that extended well beyond North America. At a time when trade war dynamics were reshaping global supply chains, Canada positioned itself as a country capable of absorbing shocks without abandoning rules-based governance. Unlike reactive economies that oscillate with political cycles, Canada framed its actions within existing trade frameworks and institutional processes. Counter tariffs were targeted. Revenue allocation was transparent. Communication was measured. The message to global investors was unmistakable. Canada remains predictable even under pressure. This mattered because capital is increasingly sensitive to political risk. As uncertainty around United States trade policy grew, Canada's extensive network of trade agreements became a strategic asset. Access to multiple markets reduced dependence on any single partner. Manufacturers seeking long-term certainty began reassessing where future production and research investment should be anchored. For allies and partners, Canada's stance reinforced its credibility as a stabilizing actor. Rather than escalating the trade war rhetorically, Canada embedded its response within multilateral norms. That approach aligned with other advanced economies seeking to limit the damage caused by unilateral tariffs. The effect was subtle but significant. Canada did not need to declare victory. Confidence flowed quietly through investment decisions, supply chain adjustments, and diplomatic engagement. In contrast, the United States faced growing scrutiny over whether its tariff strategy strengthened its negotiating position or accelerated diversification away from its market. This divergence raised an uncomfortable question for Washington. In a world where economic power is increasingly defined by networks rather than dominance, was the trade war consolidating influence or dispersing it? And this question leads directly to the most consequential phase of all. Because beyond short-term losses and diplomatic signaling, Canada began using this moment to redesign its long-term economic architecture. And what emerges next may redefine North American manufacturing in ways that cannot be easily reversed. As the trade war persisted, Canada's approach evolved in a way that many observers in the United States underestimated. What began as a defensive response to tariffs gradually transformed into a broader effort to redesign the country's economic foundations. This was not driven by ideology or nationalism, but by a sober assessment of risk. Canadian policymakers recognized a central reality. If trade policy in the United States could change abruptly, then long-term dependence on a single dominant market carried structural danger. The solution was not disengagement, but diversification with intention. Canada began accelerating efforts to deepen domestic supply chains, particularly in automotive components, advanced manufacturing, and critical industrial inputs. This shift carried immediate implications for investment. Firms operating in Canada were given a clear signal that production anchored domestically would be supported through infrastructure investment, workforce development, and regulatory predictability. Rather than chasing short-term cost advantages, Canada emphasized long-horizon stability. In an era defined by trade war volatility, that stability became a competitive asset. At the same time, Canada expanded its outward orientation. With trade agreements spanning Europe and the Asia-Pacific region, policymakers encouraged manufacturers to view Canada not merely as a production site serving the United States, but as a global export platform. This repositioning did not happen overnight, but momentum built steadily as firms reassessed risk exposure. Crucially, this strategy reframed the meaning of resilience. It was no longer about absorbing shocks and returning to the previous equilibrium. It was about using disruption as leverage to build a more autonomous and adaptable industrial structure. The auto tariffs, while damaging in the short term, became a catalyst for decisions that had been debated but deferred for years. For the United States, this pivot carried an uncomfortable implication. As Canada reduced vulnerability, Washington's leverage within the North American manufacturing ecosystem diminished. Supply chains that once defaulted to the United States began acquiring alternatives, and once those alternatives mature, they are rarely reversed. But strategic redesign always carries cost. And as Canada pushed forward, it faced its own set of risks that could determine whether this transformation succeeds or falters. Canada's long-term repositioning is neither simple nor guaranteed. Redesigning supply chains requires capital, time, and sustained political commitment. The transition away from concentrated dependence introduces short-term inefficiencies that must be managed carefully to avoid unintended consequences. For workers, the promise of stability must translate into tangible outcomes. Retraining programs, infrastructure spending, and industrial investment require coordination across multiple levels of government. Any delay risks eroding the trust that made collective action possible in the first place. Social cohesion, while a strength, cannot be taken for granted during prolonged adjustment. There are also fiscal constraints. Supporting domestic industry while maintaining open trade commitments demands careful balancing. Counter-tariffs generate revenue, but they also impose costs on consumers and businesses. Managing that trade-off will test Canada's policy discipline, particularly if the trade war extends longer than anticipated. Politically, Canada must navigate a delicate relationship with the United States. Geography and history ensure continued interdependence. Any perception that Canada is deliberately displacing American industry could invite further pressure. The challenge lies in asserting economic sovereignty without triggering escalation that would undermine growth on both sides of the border. For Washington, the risk runs in the opposite direction. As Canada builds alternatives, the United States may find that its traditional influence over North American manufacturing weakens incrementally rather than dramatically. Each investment redirected, each supply chain diversified, reduces future bargaining power. This is the paradox at the heart of the trade war. Measures intended to strengthen domestic control may accelerate the diffusion of economic power. Canada's strategy does not rely on confrontation. It relies on patience, predictability, and long-term planning, and that is what makes the next phase so consequential. Because if this trajectory continues, the most profound impact of auto tariffs will not be measured in quarterly losses or temporary layoffs. It will be measured in a permanent rebalancing of where industrial decisions are made and who sets the terms. And in the final section, we will confront the question that now hangs over Washington: whether this trade war has strengthened the United States' position or quietly set in motion forces that it can no longer fully control. The most consequential element of Canada's response to auto tariffs was not the counter tariffs themselves. It was the strategic signal embedded beneath them. While the trade war emphasized pressure, leverage, and disruption, Canada emphasized predictability, continuity, and institutional control. That contrast altered the competitive landscape in ways that are only now becoming visible. In global manufacturing, investment decisions are rarely driven by ideology. They are driven by risk assessment. When the United States introduced tariffs with limited warning and shifting justification, it injected uncertainty into long-term planning. For industries that require multi-decade capital commitments, uncertainty carries a measurable cost. Canada recognized this dynamic and moved decisively to occupy the opposite position. By framing its response within existing legal frameworks and clearly communicating policy intent, Canada reassured firms that rules would not change overnight. Counter tariffs were structured, time-bound, and linked to worker support rather than political signaling. This approach reduced volatility at a moment when volatility dominated the trade war narrative. For multinational manufacturers, the implication was subtle but powerful. Canada increasingly appeared not as a reactive participant in the trade war, but as a stabilizing anchor within it. As production strategies were reassessed, Canada's value proposition shifted. It was no longer simply a partner to the United States. It became a hedge against United States policy unpredictability. This shift does not produce immediate headlines. It manifests in boardroom conversations, investment committee votes, and supply chain redesigns that unfold quietly over time. But once these decisions are made, they are difficult to reverse. Facilities are built, talent is developed, ecosystems form around stable environments. In this sense, the trade war created an unintended hierarchy. Pressure tactics produced short-term leverage, while predictability produced long-term gravity, and Canada positioned itself on the side of gravity. Yet this twist carries a deeper implication. Because as Canada becomes more central to investment strategies, the relative influence of the United States over North American manufacturing decisions begins to erode. Not dramatically, incrementally. And incremental shifts compounded over years often prove decisive. Looking beyond immediate outcomes, the trade war raises a question that extends far past auto tariffs. In an economy defined by integration, can unilateral tariffs strengthen national power without weakening networks that sustain it? For the United States, the answer remains uncertain. Tariffs delivered political clarity to some constituencies, but they also accelerated a process of diversification that had been advancing quietly for years. Canada's response did not challenge the United States directly. It created alternatives. And alternatives reduce dependency more effectively than confrontation ever could. As Canada invests in domestic supply chains, critical inputs, and global market access, it reduces exposure to future trade shocks. Each reduction diminishes the effectiveness of tariffs as a tool of influence. Over time, the trade war risks becoming less a mechanism of control and more a catalyst for decentralization. For American workers and consumers, the implications are complex. Higher prices, constrained choice, and slower investment growth represent immediate costs. But the deeper cost may emerge later, when industries once anchored firmly within the United States distribute themselves across more stable jurisdictions. This is not an argument against cooperation. Geography and history ensure that the United States and Canada will remain deeply connected, but cooperation depends on mutual confidence. When confidence erodes, systems adapt. Canada's response demonstrates that adaptation can occur without confrontation and without retreat. And this brings us to the unresolved question at the heart of this trade war. Whether the United States strategy will recalibrate in time to preserve its central role, or whether the shift already underway has gained momentum beyond political control. Because if stability, not scale, becomes the decisive currency of global manufacturing, then the consequences of these tariffs may extend far beyond what was ever intended. And in the final section, we will confront that question directly, examining who ultimately gains, who loses, and what this moment reveals about power in a changing global economy. What began as a policy decision framed around protection has evolved into a revealing test of economic strategy in an era defined by trade war pressure. The auto tariffs imposed by the United States did more than disrupt production. They exposed how deeply modern manufacturing depends on stability, trust, and predictability. And they revealed how differently two neighboring economies interpret power. Canada did not respond with panic or provocation. It responded with structure, coordination, and long-term intent. By protecting workers, reinforcing domestic capacity, and quietly diversifying beyond excessive reliance on the United States, Canada transformed tariffs from a threat into a catalyst. In doing so, it demonstrated that resilience in a trade war is not built through force alone, but through consistency. For the United States, the outcome remains unresolved. Tariffs delivered political clarity in the short term, but they also accelerated strategic adjustments that may reduce American leverage over time. Higher costs, shifting investment patterns, and growing skepticism about policy reliability now shape decisions far beyond the auto sector. Once supply chains adapt, they rarely return to their previous form. This is why the true impact of this trade war may not be visible in quarterly data or election cycles. It may emerge slowly, as manufacturing gravity shifts toward environments that reward predictability over pressure. And here is the final question that Washington must now confront. Is this a bold strategy that strengthens the United States, or a risky mistake that quietly empowers alternatives? Stay with us, because the next phase of this trade war may already be unfolding beneath the surface. Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis.